We've got some fresh new young talent doing some things that I know you haven't heard before.
1, 2, 3, listen.
Welcome to Finances, your home for all things financial, investment, money and lifestyle. Hosted and curated by the very talented team of certified financial planners and Burke Britton Financial Partners. This is episode number 104 of the Finances podcast. Today's guest is a client, he's a friend, and someone I've looked forward to having a bit more of a long-form conversation with. Although, Bernard, you and I, we tend to have pretty long-form conversations when we catch up at your place. But this is today's guest is Bernard Muir, emeritus. Let me try that again. Emeritus Professional Fellow, University of Melbourne, visiting scholar and senior fellow at Newman College, and director of Vellum Digital Publishing. How did I go with that?
Yeah, all right, yeah. I say it like email, e-vellum.
E-vellum,
yeah.
Okay.
Vellum's parchment.
So, emeritus. Emeritus.
Yeah.
What does the
If we can stop for a second. At a very, very low level, it means you're retired. But, you know, it's actually a special title. It just means you're deserving.
Okay.
A really renowned professor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's a pretty nice title to have. That's why it's on all of your emails, and it reflects who you are. So let's start there.
Again.
Yeah. So Bernard, how long have you and I known each other for?
Since 2010.
Okay. And how long have you been working in the universities as a professor? Like how long? This
is my 43rd year.
Okay. So let's go back before your 43rd year, and let's start with where you grew up. So where were you born? Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school?
Yeah, everything in Toronto.
Okay.
I went to the Cathedral Choir School as a little kid. Was there for 10 years. Sang everything in Latin, which is what happened to me. I became a medievalist.
Okay.
And then I went to the University of Toronto, and I did 4 degrees there. And one of them was a special degree with the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies. There's only 2 in the world that are affiliated with Rome. And it's a 3-year degree called a licentiate. And what it is, in the Middle Ages, you had to have a license to teach. And that was it. They didn't give you a piece of paper or a degree. They gave you a license, and consequently it's called a licentiate.
That was a pretty quick jump from your early childhood to your medieval studies. What happened in the middle, other than being a good student and working well in the choir?
Yeah.
Where did this passion for sort of medieval studies and language, where did that come from? Did it come from your parents? Was it
out of the blue? To me, it seemed like a natural development, because having sung in Latin for all those years, when I went to high school, I took Latin as well as other things. And when I got to university, I did Latin and English and history. And I've been doing Latin since I was about 10 or 11 years old, yeah.
So where did you go to? You went to high school in Toronto?
Yeah, the same place.
Yep.
The Cathedral Choir School. I went to the end of high school.
Okay.
Then I went to the University
of Toronto?
Yeah, Catholic College, St. Michael's in Toronto. There for 4 years, got an honors BA. Then I went, applied for a PhD, which I got into, and I did that until 1981. So I was there for
when you say you did that until 1981,
you 4 degrees at Toronto.
Okay.
Took 12 years, but I was married and had 2 kids over there as well. So, and a mortgage, and worked night crew in a supermarket.
Okay. So the 4 degrees that you acquired in that 12-year period, what were they?
Well, the honors BA, then I did an MA, then I did the medieval license. It's called an MSL, Medieval Studies Licentiate, and then I did the PhD. So 12 years.
So for the uninitiated and for the novices like myself, what is what are the medieval times? The times that you're
Yeah.
expert in. What are they?
Yeah, my specialization is Anglo-Saxon England, which is England up until the Norman conquest of 1066. So I teach from about 700 to 1066. That's my area of expertise. I've published books in Old English. I've done 22 books now, and I do Latin. I've done several of those books are Latin. I edit religious texts. I edit secular texts, and right now I'm working on Roman tragedies. And the criticism of them, the commentary system on those tragedies from written in about 1310 or so by an English scholar, basically. So, yeah, Nicholas Trevette was his name.
Okay.
And he wrote this huge commentary, because there's 10 plays. It goes on forever. We've already written 4,000 footnotes for this book. So it's a huge commentary, but he wrote it because during the monastic period in England, so you're talking about from, the 6th century to the 12th century.
Is this at the sort of the fall of the Roman Empire?
Roman Empire fell in 410.
Okay.
And then for the next 500 years, the Roman system of schooling disappeared, and all the knowledge of advanced things like Greek studies, Aristotle, Plato, nobody could read them in the West. So the monasticism took over, and every book produced in England up until about 1100 was written out by a monk. And in the 8th century, because the Roman Empire had declined on the continent, English scholars were the best in the world. The one that's known mostly is Venerable Bede, who lived in 673 to 735, and he wrote dozens of books and commentaries on the Bible. He wrote grammars, studies of meter and things like that. And he was the leading scholar in Europe, and he never left the monastery up in Northumbria in England. He spent his whole life there. He went in when he was about 8 years old, and he died when he was, about 62 or so.
We talked just off air about the Stoics, the Greeks and the Roman philosophers. The works that you're doing at the moment sort of hark back and reflect on some of the plays of some of the early Stoics. Is that correct?
Yeah, Seneca. Seneca was Nero's tutor. Eventually, somebody poisoned Nero's mind against Seneca because everybody was jealous of him. He had more money than Nero. He was the richest man in Rome. And they poisoned, his reputation with Nero. And Nero one day said to him, "Well, Seneca, don't come back tomorrow. Go home and commit suicide tonight, which is the only way out. Otherwise, we send the Praetorian Guard around tomorrow morning and they chop you up." So, so Seneca committed suicide. But not only was he a Stoic philosopher, but he wrote these. 10 plays are attributed to him. He probably only wrote 8 of them. The other 2 are in a Senecan style, and they became very, very popular in Elizabethan England.
So what year would that be?
Okay, what happened was they disappeared with everything else.
At the
with
fall,
the fall of the Roman Empire,
okay.
And the schooling system went, but copies were preserved in Italy and places like that, and well, what happened was that after the fall of the Roman Empire, nobody could speak Greek in Western Europe anymore. So all the works of Aristotle, Plato, and all the scientific writers in Greek who wrote all, medical treatises and all that kind of thing, just disappeared. And, what brought it back was in the 7th century, the Arabs began to expand across North Africa, as you know, and they preserved Aristotle. and they wrote commentaries on Aristotle in Arabic. And those are the people that gave Aristotle back to the West. And when they rediscovered Aristotle, it was about the late 10th, early 11th century, they started to translate Aristotle into Latin. Because people could read Latin, they couldn't read Greek at that stage. And all the new ideas that were in Aristotle, things people had never thought about for 500-600 years, came flooding in. And that's when the universities were founded. Late 11th, early 12th century, or 12th century mostly. Around 1209 or something for Cambridge and Oxford, 1220. So beginning of the 13th century, English universities started. Wouldn't have been possible without the rediscovery of Aristotle. So really important. And, of course, with that came the Latin tradition, and Stoic philosophy was part of that. And the church fathers, the Christian church fathers in Rome and northern Africa and so on, they liked Seneca because of his stoicism. He was very severe. He showed you what happens to you if you don't lead a good life and so on. I have a book, I take it sometimes for fun on the tram when I go to university on the tram. And it's got a black cover, and all it says on it is How to Die. Okay, and it's a book of Seneca's Stoic philosophy.
Is is it Memento Mori? No. What's the?
No. Prepare yourself for death.
Yeah.
But by living a good life now. But they don't know about purgatory and stuff like that. They just meant living in this world. You had to live a good life. And so if you sit on the tram with a backpack on and you're reading a book called How to Die, people start moving away from you.
Some of the other, I suppose, the Renaissance of Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. What era was Meditations? Was that
Marcus Aurelius's stuff? Yeah, it was late Roman Empire.
Okay.
Yeah, but it always remained popular too. Because it was in Latin, it was more accessible.
So after the fall of the Roman Empire and it was the Arabs that actually sort of rediscovered.
Yeah, the Arabs took over North Africa, and North Africa had always been a Roman province, and they took that over, and they came right around to Gibraltar. They crossed over into Spain, and they took over Spain, and this was all by the time of Charlemagne, early 9th century. We have the famous old French poem, the Chanson de Roland. It's about the French resistance against the Arab invasion of Spain. They wanted to come into France, you see. Anyway, it's a great story, but we owe a lot to them. They took over Sicily as well, because Sicily is very important in the Mediterranean. It sits right in the middle, and it's got straits on either side of it, but it's hard to get around Sicily. And if you look at a map, northern Egypt around Libya and that, it goes up above the foot of South Italy and Sicily. Sicily is lower down than North Africa. And so you can see why it was such an advantageous place to be. And then ultimately, after the Normans got in after 1066 and the Crusades, and they're spreading across Europe to go to the Holy Land and so on, they took over Sicily and forced the Arabs out. So if you go to Sicily, I went about 3 or 4 years ago. Fantastic, because there's sort of 4 periods of architecture there, all simultaneously. The Carthaginians that were from northern Italy, or northern Africa rather, and had taken over that end of the Mediterranean, and then the Romans came and replaced, the Greeks rather, came and replaced the Carthaginians, and then the Romans took over and defeated the Carthaginians and the Greeks and took over, and eventually the Normans came. So you got 4 major cultures. If you go there today, you can see, an Arabic building standing beside a Romanesque building, standing beside Greek ruins and Roman ruins. It's really a fascinating place to be. It's because of its location.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we said off air how we have this sense that things have always been the way they are at the moment. Like we really reflect on our own experience and the ability to actually look back through literature and see that transition of cultures. What, in looking at your area of expertise and that period of time in the medieval period, what are the things that surprise you most about sort of human nature and culture when you sort of compare it against today?
Nothing changes. All these empires eventually become corrupt. Politicians become corrupt. It's all about money and land. And if you look across Europe and right across, right around the Mediterranean, you see all the beautiful cathedrals from the 12th, 13th, 14th century. Who built them? The peasants. That's what they had to do. They didn't get paid. They'd be lucky if they got some food handed out to them. So when they weren't planting and harvesting for their masters, they worked every day on building the cathedrals. So, lots of things haven't changed in some ways.
So the parallels between, maybe let's talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, which again is kind of the beginning of that medieval period. Yeah. What are some of the other parallels you see in the sort of the fall, and what I suppose what's in literature in terms of the fall of the Roman Empire and what actually caused it, and what parallels can you correlate to today?
Well, the thing is that the Roman Empire, like all empires before them, eventually got overthrown by the next empire. And so what happened with Rome and Greece was the Celts and the Germanic people started coming from the eastern end of the Mediterranean. The Celts may have come from the Russian steppes, right across the Mediterranean, north of the Mediterranean.
When you say the Russian steppes, meaning?
In Russia, where today, the Middle East, just north. You go north and you get to the Russian steppes.
Okay.
Anyway, so if you go back to about the 7th century BC, the Greeks were the first ones to call the Irish Celts. In Herodotus, they're called Keltoi, and they've still got that name today. And nobody knows quite where it came from, but it came from the steppes, and they migrated right across the top of Greece and Italy, and ended up in France, and consequently Brittany, for example, British people and so on, and parts of England were Celtic, and Ireland is Celtic. Scotland was Celtic after the Picts got pushed north by the Christians, who were Irish. So the Celts came right across for hundreds of years, and basically France became Celtic, Irish, if you will. And of course, those peoples speak languages derived from Latin because the Romans were there first. And then after them, the Germanic tribes came down from northern Europe, and they did the same thing. They sacked Rome in 410. They took over Italy. They went across. They took over what was the French, the Celtic areas. And so the whole thing became Germanic. If you go to northern Italy and you notice that the North Italians are a different color and have different hair color than the South Italians, well, it's because there's African influence in the South. And in the North, Lombardy was the Longobards were Germans. They had blonde hair, blue eyes, and so on. And you find blonde hair in northern Italy. And so it's very fascinating to watch the cultures going over each other and displacing each other.
Yeah, and I think when you overlay that against like some of the more recent conflicts and just how much the legacy of some of those transitions in cultures and people, obviously the Germanic the Aryan race. So when they talk about when you talk about Germany and like Hitler's want to sort of
blue-eyed, blonde-haired people.
Yeah. So what was
he didn't have blue eyes and blonde hair.
What was that period? That region, like in medieval times, who who was in charge of sort of what was the Aryan area? Who were the Aryan people?
All of Europe above where modern day France is, on the west side of Europe, was all Germanic tribes. The Germanic peoples are in Norway, Sweden, Iceland. Then you come down the coast, Saxony, Angeln, all these places. The Netherlands, they're Germanic. So the whole of northwest Europe was Germanic. And in the 5th century, they jumped across the English Channel, which wasn't called that at the time. They were invited over as allies for some of the people in Anglo-Saxon England, or in British England, I should have said, because the Angles and the Saxons were the ones they invited over, and some people from Jutland called Jutes came, and they took over and displaced the natives. The natives were British, and these Germanic peoples coming in were all heathens in the Christian point of view, and the British that were there were actually Christians, because the Romans had been there and they converted them all in the 4th century. So you had a British church that was Roman, and then you had the Germanic peoples coming in and displacing them, and then there's tides of other influences from Italy, from Ireland rather. They had taken on Christianity in a big way, and they had a different kind of Christianity because they're on the furthest reaches of Europe, and Caesar never got there. The Romans never bothered with Ireland, and so their culture continued. And then in the about the 7th century, they started to migrate across where we have the Hadrian's Wall now, separating Scotland and England. They came across that area from the island of Iona, which is off the west coast of Scotland, and they set up monasteries, Christian monasteries, and they started to convert the pagan Germanic peoples. And at the same time that was happening, this happened around 597, the Pope at the time was Gregory the Great. He's Gregory the First. He sent missionaries to the south of England, and they landed in Canterbury in the same year, 597, and they began converting the southern English kings to Christianity. So you had two different rites. You had the Celtic rite in the north, which came from Ireland, and in the south you had the Roman rite coming up through Canterbury into Kent and all over southern England. So a really interesting interaction between the different races or nationalities. My own approach was linguistic in the first place. And I studied, when I went to university, I didn't know anything about this before I went to university. I studied Anglo-Saxon, as it was called then. We call it Old English now. And it was from about, the recorded documents start in the 7th century.
So some of the documents you showed me before we started, the books, that's the Old English. The
that's
stuff
Old English
that you said to me, read that, and I couldn't, but you could see some similarity. But we talked just off air about the evolution of that Old English language to sort of current modern day English, and the influence that the French had on converting that from Old English to modern day English, or the other way around.
Well, what happens is, see, if you study the language in England, you first get there, and a lot of the place names in that are Celtic or British. And some of them still are. But then the Germanic peoples came, and they pushed the Celtic peoples up into Scotland, into Wales, and into Cornwall. That's why they all speak funny language in Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland, because the Germanic peoples displaced them. But when you do that, you take on influences from them. So the English language, if you study it, you can see Latin words in it. You can see Celtic words in it. You see most of it back then was Germanic, and a lot of the Germanic words are single syllables, whereas Latin and Greek are multi-syllable words, multi-syllabic words. And with Christianity came Christian theology. Well, you tell a Germanic people that you're going to convert them to a God who died on a crucifix, on a cross. And they say, yeah, well, our gods don't die like that. Why should we believe in your God? And there weren't words in English to describe a trinity. That's a Latin word. So they made a word that's parallel to it, and they called it a threeness. Spelled different, it looks funny in Old English, but it was a threeness, and it's just a translation of Trinity. And they had to create new words to accommodate Christian ideas. And so if you study the language, you get the culture, you get the history, you get the waves of influence in England.
How much do you think's been lost in translation from sort of Latin, like even you go back to sort of biblical text and the conversion of that from sort of ancient Hebrew and Latin to Old English? Like, how much is lost in translation over those?
Well, what's
millennia?
lost? I'll tell you what happened, because, as I said, the Normans showed up, as we all know, in 1066, and they just had to knock off one person, and they inherited all of England. They just had to kill, the Germanic king, which they did. And by one little battle down in Hastings, you kill one person and you got the whole country.
Good to go.
It's amazing how fast things change. And then what happened then was that for the next 350 years, there's extreme French influence on everything in England, culturally. Our words government, parliament, those are all French words. They took over the running of England, and all those kinds of terms came into English. Over a 300-year period, everything began to be Frenchified, if you want. And by the end of the Norman period, you get to the Renaissance, nobody could read Old English anymore, you see. So in the 16th century, scholars working like with Henry VIII and that, under Henry VIII, when they sacked all the monasteries, took all the expensive books and everything, and burned a lot of them to the ground. By the 16th century, nobody could read those manuscripts anymore. So that's another interesting thing to look at. And that's what I study. I study how you recover what's been lost.
So how do you recover? Like if no one's about to...
I'll tell you, it's really interesting, because they had to start from nothing in the 15th century, in the early 16th century. They didn't know any Old English. They were speaking a lot of it still, but it was Frenchified, if you will. And so they took the manuscripts, and a famous manuscript in the British Library now, the Lindisfarne Gospels. It's the most renowned book in England, and one of the finest manuscripts ever made. In the 10th century, it was in Latin, because it was the Bible, the Gospels. Somebody went along, his name was Aldred, in the 10th century, and he glossed every word in Latin with an Old English word above it. And working from the Latin to the Old English, they began to compile dictionaries. And that's what went on. They found 3 or 4 other gospel books that had glosses, and they began to compare them and compile dictionaries, grammars, and so on. So English was rediscovered in the 16th century, and it's a big growth area now in my field.
It's interesting I've never thought of it that way, in that English was rediscovered, that it existed, disappeared, and what we speak today was the rebirth of English.
Yeah, and influenced, late in the Norman period by the Renaissance. And that's when they began to rediscover Greek and introduce all of the long medical terms and botanical terms and all those words that have so many syllables that are Greek. They came in the Renaissance. They weren't there until then. So
is that around the same time that the sort of interest and influence of the Stoics was reborn in the Renaissance, or was it
right after that? Because that was about the 15th century or so. This was all happening. It's not just in literature and history; it's in art, architecture, everywhere. You can see the development of European culture in anything you look at, whether it's art, architecture, things like that. So, yes, the Stoics, Seneca's plays, and he had 10 of them. 8 we think are genuine, 2 are copies.
When you say copies,
well, not copies,
he
but
poached them off someone else.
No, they wrote plays in his style.
Okay.
2 of them, and so they're not really copies, but they're written as if Seneca wrote them. And for a long time, they were considered part of the Seneca corpus, 10 tragedies. Now we only recognize 8, but because
the final 2 were imitations.
well, they're not bad, but they're not as good as the original 8. The style's not as good, Seneca was a great thinker in that, and we don't even know who wrote the other 2, but they're not as good as the 8 he wrote.
And they're not his.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, but in England, they rediscovered Seneca and his tragedies. And, obviously they could all read Latin if they had an education in the Renaissance. And Seneca became very, very popular because he was, upright and moral and severe and believed you should live a good life and so on. And so if you look in Elizabethan England, Shakespeare was hugely influenced by Seneca. He has a play called Titus Andronicus, which is almost a translation. It's a reworking of one of Seneca's tragedies, and it's a gruesome thing. They love the Seneca because it's all gruesome. In this one that Shakespeare wrote, the Titus Andronicus, the theme is that 2 brothers had a falling out, and were almost at war with each other. And one of them had sons, and the other one didn't. The one that didn't have the kids came to visit the one with the 2 boys, and while he was there, he had them killed and baked in a pie.
Oh, nice.
Nice, eh? I mean, this is what the Seneca's tragedies are about. Things like this, they're gruesome. And then they served the pie to the father, you see, who was sitting there eating his children without realizing, oh, this is good pie, Yeah. Anyway, but that's the kind of thing that's in Seneca's tragedies, and they loved it in Elizabethan England, and it spilled over into France as well, and it influenced, French drama in the 17th century and so on. But the reason why Seneca survived was because he was so severe and insisted on leading a good life. The early church fathers in the 3rd and 4th century loved Seneca. They said, there's a man worth reading, don't read Catullus's ribald poetry or love poetry. Read Seneca. Learn how to live the good life. So Seneca led a blessed existence in Western culture because he was favored by the church, whereas a lot of the other Roman Latin literature fell into disregard. People didn't read it. They didn't copy the manuscripts because every book had to be copied by hand. There was no printing press. And why would the church, the monks in the monasteries, why would they copy out love poetry when they could copy out something about, cooking your kids for dinner and how you got to lead the good life? So Seneca survived, and a lot of other stuff didn't. The one who saved Latin literature was Charlemagne. He was crowned Roman emperor in 800 on Christmas Day in Rome, and he wanted to recreate the Roman Empire in France. It wasn't France at the time; it was called Gaul.
So this is sort
Germanic
of 400 years after the fall of the empire. No,
400. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, this was happening around 800, and the empire fell in 410. So he wants. It's often called the Carolingian Renaissance. It's like there were 2 Renaissances, because if it hadn't been for Charlemagne saving all of these books, he sent his people to Italy to go through all the libraries and find, good copies of Latin texts and to bring them back to his empire, to the Carolingian Empire, centered around Aachen and the monasteries around that in southern Germany today and northern France, and copied them out. And if you go to the library at the university and you get out like the Oxford Classical Text series, and you open the front. In the front, they always tell you what manuscripts they've been using. And in 90% of them, the earliest manuscript is from the 9th century because of Charlemagne. If he hadn't had them copied,
It's gone.
we wouldn't have it today.
Talking about some of those ancient works that have lost. This is again probably a naive question. The Library of Alexandria. When did that exist? When was it burnt down or destroyed?
Yeah, like in the 1st century A.D.
Okay.
It went down. It was the biggest library in the world. They had a copy of every book in the world in it, and that was a great loss when it went down. They had tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 of, but it was all on papyrus rolls, right? Because they didn't have books yet at that time. Everything was on a roll or a scroll, which you unwound as you read it. And you wound it up with your left hand, and you unwound it with your right hand, and you stored them in tubes. So you just put it back in the tube, and it had a little tag on the end of the manuscript that hung down, and it said, Seneca, or it said Aristotle on the little things. So that's how you organized your library, probably alphabetically or by country or something.
Have they got any idea how much was lost? Meaning,
we know that, like, you look at Greek tragedies, we know that some of the major tragedians wrote over 100, plays, and maybe 3 or 4 survive. So you're talking about huge losses. And we only know that there were 100 because other authors quote bits from them. So you can say, oh, look, he's quoting this book. We don't have it anymore. And you go all through, early Roman literature, and they're referring to things that just don't exist anymore. You might have 4 or 5 plays by Sophocles, and he wrote over 100 or something. So, most of it's lost. And as I said, they were on papyrus rolls, and that's what made Alexandria significant, because the papyrus was all from Egypt, and it had spread over into Sicily. They grew papyrus in Sicily as well, and that was what you made books from. And it seemed natural that would develop in Alexandria, because that's where all the papyrus was. But later, in about the 2nd century A.D., they started in a city called Pergamon to make writing materials out of animal hides. And that's called parchment from Pergamon. Paper is called paper from papyrus. You see, so you got the 2 different kinds of writing materials, and the parchment and vellum. Vellum is our word veal in modern English. It's a younger cow than an older one, and consequently be finer. Parchment, because it's thinner, hasn't been bitten by as many insects. And
is there
so
any
on.
relation between vellum digital publishing and?
Well, there is. That's why I made up the name. It was modeled on email. This was electronic parchment, vellum, and that's where I got the idea for the name. I was thinking of e-parchment, but somebody had already done that, I found, once I started searching. So I did e-vellum, and been doing it for 30 years now. My first things came out about 30 or 35 years ago. But we have all kinds of descriptions of how you prepare animal skins. It was a massive industry, because you think every book that was written after the 3rd century was written on an animal skin. It would have been tens of millions of animals slaughtered. One gospel book would take 500 skins to prepare. So these monasteries, they would be out there, and the peasants would be working with them, and they would be killing cattle at a huge rate, but nothing went to waste. They ate the cattle, and all the little bits of leather left over or cowhide left over, well, they made shoelaces out of it, belts, but the big pieces in the middle, they used for books. The spine of the animal running down its back is usually the spine of the book. But there was another tendency to turn it sideways, because if you make the parchment the same shape as the cow, then it wants to bend inwards like a cow's body. But if you turn it sideways, then there's a tension between bending in and being the other direction. So often the spine would run horizontally rather than vertically down the book. But it was all done on cowskins. So to make these 3 Bibles at the end of the 7th century in Northumbria, it took 1,500 cowskins. 1,500. Can you imagine? You had to scrape the fat off the inside, and dip them in lime and leave them for a while to burn everything off and loosen the hair up. Then you had to get a razor and shave the hair off the animal, and so on, and cure it. And if it's a fine book, you want to get the parchment as thin as you can, because you're going to have 400 pages. You don't want it, a foot high. You want it about 3 inches high or 2 inches high. So they made the parchment very fine.
So who was in charge of scribing? Who were the
monks?
The monks.
In the monastery. They would have the scriptorium, which is where you write the books, and they'd have a master of the scriptorium, and there would be monks copying. They didn't just do it in the scriptorium. They might go outside and sit, if it's the summer, sit outside under, in a corridor under a roof, so they could get natural light, because there was no natural light inside the monasteries. And that's where they made the books. So it's a really interesting tale. The book I'm editing right now, it's the oldest book of English poetry. It's called the Exeter Anthology. It's one of the ones there I've brought, but no, it's the just the cover there, because I haven't finished it. But in it has 94 riddles. Okay, and the riddles, they can be from 1 line long to 100 lines long, and about 12 of them, the solution is something from a scriptorium. Like riddle 26 is about making the sacred scriptures, and it says, "I was in the field, and my enemies came and killed me and took my skin off, laid it in the sun, dipped it in lye," this kind of stuff. But then they wrote on me with gold and painted me beautifully, and now I'm useful to man. I'm holy in myself, it says, and that's because the name for the scriptures is the Holy Scriptures, or Sacra Scriptura in Latin. So, they have riddles like that. Other ones will be solved as a feather that's used for, making a quill to write, because they use feathers for writing. They made quills, and that kind of thing. So it's really interesting.
In some of those sort of cultural and religious texts, what was when you're reading those, what sort of segueing into sort of money and finance, what can you see in terms of people's influence and attitudes towards money and wealth in some of those scriptures, or is it avoided? Is it not discussed?
No, what it is because they believe that the Bible was the Word of God, because of their notion of Trinity, and the second one of the Trinity was the Word. At the beginning of St. John's Gospel, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and God was with the Word," and so on. And that's where they developed the whole idea of a Trinity, was out of the beginning of the Gospel of St. John. And the Word was what God the Father used to make creation. But the Word became identified with Christ, the second person of the Trinity. And so the Bible itself was regarded as sacred. That's why they call it sacred scriptures, because it was God. It was the story of God's intervention in the world, and about Christ's coming and salvation and all that kind of stuff. So they spent countless amounts of money making beautiful books. They put jewels on the cover. They would pour gold on the large initials in the manuscript. They made paints. They got things from all over. They got lapis lazuli from Afghanistan in northern England to make the blues for the gospel books. You know, they get purples came from shellfish in the Red Sea. You know, I mean, the industry that went into making a book, it was the biggest industry in Europe, because every book
So
had to be made.
wealth was reflected or portrayed in
How many books you
how
own.
many books you own.
Yeah. And how good they were.
And how decorative they were.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. And they still survive. You see, the wonderful thing about the books is that because they're written on animal skin, parchment, they look, if they haven't been damaged by water and fire, they look the same today as the day they were made. It doesn't deteriorate. It's animal skin and it's been cured. And
What is the text written in most instances? What is the text itself on the parchment
yeah,
actually?
the language?
The writing. What's the ink or what?
Well, yeah, I've made a CD, 3 of them, in fact. They're on my website, but I use them to teach at the university. But one of them is on how you actually make a book, and we made one, my friend John Stinson and I.
So you killed a cow.
Well, we bought the parchment from an American guy who killed the cow, and we filmed the whole process of every stage of making a book, you know. And then the second volume, I got a fellow who works down south of Footscray, and he's world famous as a maker of inks and paints for artists. And he sells his products all over the world. And he came, and for nothing, he worked for nothing. He came up, and we made a film of him making inks, crushing minerals up and all this kind of stuff. And it's on those CDs. And the third one was on illuminating an initial with real gold and so on. And we have a woman who has a shop or studio down in Burwood, and we filmed her making an illuminated initial. So we made three CDs like that, and they're called Inside the Scriptorium. So one's on the book, one's on the paints and inks, and one's on the gold that they used. I just came back from France and England, studying Seneca manuscripts, and one of the ones we found in the Society of Antiquaries in London. Okay, they had this manuscript there of Seneca, and part of Seneca and the commentary discusses all the constellations and star signs. And I could show you pictures, but for every star in a constellation, like if you drew Cancer or, Libra, and it might have 10 stars in it, each star is in the right place, and it's a drop of pure gold about 3 millimeters high. And they're beautiful. And that's the kind of thing. That's just part of the commentary on Seneca. And they're using gold to show you where the stars are, and not just gold leaf. This was liquid gold that was 3 mils thick. It shows you just in an ordinary book like that, they're using gold. But it was made for the King of France, probably, so he had money.
Yeah. On this note of some of the works that you've actually produced, am I allowed to say you're a sort of a pioneer of kind of the digital humanities? There's not many people that are out there doing what you're doing. How has technology changed the way that we study? Not only people that come to be taught and lectured to by yourself, but the likes of myself who are novices in these areas. How's technology changed the understanding of sort of medieval transcripts and the way people study?
Yeah, when I came to Australia in 1982, beginning of 82, everybody was using IBM electric typewriters at the university. And then after a few years, they got electronic typewriters where you had 3 lines of text, rather, at the top of your electronic typewriter. And then around 89, I think, they made me the first dean of information technology because I knew how to turn on a computer. And I wrote one of the books I wrote here. I actually typed it in what you'd call a broom closet at the university because that's the only place they had for a big printer. You used to have these huge printers that were noisy. We had, sound covers over them to retard the sound. Sound like Gatling guns going off when they were printing. And wrote my first book in what's a electric's room or a broom closet. Call it what you will. It wasn't very big. And then they made me associate dean, and my job was to bring IT to Melbourne Uni arts faculty, and I set up what's now today called Arts IT. I set it up 30-odd years ago, and hired some excellent programmers, and they worked with me for 15, 18 years before they went off in their own directions. And I brought digital humanities to Melbourne. And the reason why I was aware of it was because Toronto had a huge digital humanities faculty or department, you could call it. It was on the top floor of the 14-story library in Toronto, and they'd been running digital humanities for about 10 years there, but nobody had ever heard of it here, And so the dean at that time was a good friend of mine, and things were much less formal back then than they are today. We were having lunch, and he said, "What are we going to do to get this going, Bernard?" And he was American, and I said, "Well, I need some money. You want to get it going?" He said, "Well, what do you need?" I said, "I got to have a project." I said, "Give me 50 grand." This was 30 years ago, right? 50 grand's a lot of money, Bernard. I said, "Yeah, I know. It's an expensive business, and it's the future." So he said, "Okay," and he transferred 50 grand to my account at the university, research grant. I mean, it wasn't cash for me. It was to get digital humanities going. And today, you'd have to go through so many committees and run it by so many people, et cetera. We just did it over lunch, So times have changed, and it's never looked back, And then I set up these series. I have a series I established with Oxford University called the Bodleian Digital Text Series. I've done 3 or 4 in that series now. Really important manuscripts, and so on. So,
how hard is it to successfully secure grants these days?
It's an interesting business, getting grants. I've had more grants than anybody I know in arts. I mean, I'm sure there's people over in medicine that have had more. But these are large grants that come from the federal government to the Australian Research Council. And I've had 9 of them. And most people would kill to have 1 of them. Because once you got a track record, the next time you apply, when they were evaluating your application, 45% of it used to go for track record. Well, I had the track record, nobody else did. So I had overlapping ARC grants. At one time I had 3 running simultaneously. And people would just look and say, "How do you do that?" But it's the way it happens. And
has it got something to do with your emphasis around aspiring to perfection? I know that's kind of a philosophy that you apply in most of what you do. How's that impacted your ability to?
Yeah. I'm known all around the world in medieval studies. Everybody knows me. I can go to any library in Europe. And, I go to the Vatican Library, you just walk in, "How are you, Professor Muir?" "Oh, fine, thanks, buongiorno." And, go to Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale, the British Library in London, Cambridge. It's got several really important libraries in Cambridge and in Oxford. And you just walk in. I mean, you have to tell them you're coming because it's so organized nowadays with IT and digital communications and that you set it all up before you go. And I can, like this last trip I just did in November, you walk into the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and the book you ordered is sitting on the shelf that day waiting for you, because I said I'll be there on, the 10th of November. I want this book, and you go in, and it's sitting there. Now, that never used to happen. But now, I can go anywhere in the world, and that's the way it works. They know you, and they respect you.
That's pretty handy. It's not what you know, it's who you know. You obviously know a few people in high places. When it comes to thinking about all the eras and texts that you've studied, is there a time in history that if you could go back and be a fly on the wall, physically be there, that you would most want to go to?
Oh, yeah, would like hanging around with Charlemagne. That would have been fun. No, let me tell you, times are changing. Okay, nothing stays the same, as you know.
But everything stays the same.
Yeah. But I introduced digital, editing technology to the arts faculty, but I've now gone back to publishing in hard copy. Okay? And the reason is that, for example, the Lindisfarne Gospels in the British Library was made around 710, okay? And it still looks as beautiful as the day they made it. My CDs I made 20 years ago don't work anymore because you're at the mercy of the developers of browsers, and everything we did up until 15 years ago depended on the software Flash. And then one day they decided not to support it anymore or use it. And all the CDs and everybody's work that they put into all those CDs, I got stacks of them at home I bought, not my own. Everybody made them, and none of them work. So I thought, well, that's not longevity. And longevity's always been something they wanted you to promise them. I said, well, I can't promise you anything because I don't run the technology. The developers do, the browser developers, It's all owned by Microsoft and people like that. So I said, I want my books to be here 100 or 200 years from now. So the last 4 books you see sitting on the counter, they're in hard copy because they'll be here. I can give you a digital version too. I do sell digital versions of them, but I want my books to be on a shelf somewhere.
Seems as though what is old is new again.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of these books and where people can actually find your books. I didn't say at the beginning, how many books have you published? You might have mentioned it. How many have you published?
About 20.
Okay. And your most recent ones, we've got 3 here.
Yeah.
The first one?
That's a Cadman manuscript. It's from around 970, 975. That's the Peterborough Chronicle. It's the most famous English chronicle. That was finished in 1154 with the death of King Stephen.
And this is volume 1 of that, so volume 1 and volume 2.
Yeah, that's the text that you can't read in there, but
I
did a translation. So that's what the second one is there. But I usually don't do translations of Old English because I want students to learn Old English. I want them to be able to do the translations eventually. But if you want something to sell, like that Peterborough Chronicle is very, very important. I just brought it out a year ago and it's selling well, especially in Europe. They have chronicle societies in Europe and things like that. We don't have them over here. Not enough people. But in Europe, they got enough people to produce expensive books like that. And these books, each volume there costs nearly $400. So if you wanted that little set of 2 books, it's $800 Australian.
And this one?
That's the mate of the other 2, the Exeter one you saw, and then we just saw the Junius, the Cadman one there. That's known as Junius manuscript. It's in Oxford. It's an illustrated biblical book, the Junius, the Cadman one there. It's called Cadman because it's from a story in Bede's Ecclesiastical History that he published in 731, just before he died. I say published. He finished it, and then people started copying it. That's what you call publishing. He has a story in it about how this illiterate cowherd used to get up when they're having a feast or a party, and they'd pass around the harp around the table, and you had to sing a poem or something and then pass the harp to the next guy. And every time he saw the harp coming, he got up and left the feast because he couldn't sing. He didn't know how to sing poetry or write it. And he went home, and there's similar stories in other cultures, but during the night, a divine spirit comes to him, an angel, and says, "Sing for me, Cadman." And on the underneath the picture on there, there's what he said to him. What did he say? Cadman said, "I don't know how to sing," and the angel said, "You'll sing for me." And he said, "What should I sing?" And the angel said to him, "Whatwugu." Whatwugu means something, anything.
Anything.
Yeah. And he said, "But I don't know how." But he got the gift of song from the angel. Okay. Now other cultures have similar songs because, like mythologies, they're in every culture. But that's where that one. That's why I've called it the Cadman manuscript. That's going back because everybody says they used to think Cadman wrote it because Bede tells us that he wrote things on Genesis, Exodus, and about Christ, and those are the subjects of the poems in that manuscript. So I decided to go back and use the original name, and everybody will say, "Oh, we all know Cadman didn't write those." Of course I know that, but it's folkloric. It's historical. Everybody knows the story of Cadman. I brought that out as a CD, 2004, and that's 20 years ago. And the Oxford wouldn't let me call it the Cadman manuscript. They said, "Oh, that's not the real title. It's Oxford Bodleian Library, Manuscript Junius 11. And I said, "Yeah, that's a real selling point, isn't it?" I said, "If you call it the Cadman manuscript, people don't know what it is, But they didn't. They wouldn't. And it didn't sell very well. Okay? Because, first of all, they charged $400 for it, which, who's going to buy it? I said, I wouldn't buy one, I said to them. So when I did this one, it just came out last year, I said, my turn to go back and call it the Cadman manuscript again. So I love rocking the boat.
Do you have a favorite poem?
Oh, yeah. There's, it's not in that one. It's in the Vercelli one you're holding in your hand. That Vercelli Codex is an anthology of Christian poetry focusing on Easter. And by coincidence, so is the Cadman manuscript. They both are, somebody put them together, probably for a rich lay patron back in the 10th century. A guy said, "I want a book of things to read, at Easter." And both of those have poems about Easter in it. And the one in your hand there, the Vercelli book, has the most famous poem in Old English. It's called The Dream of the Rood. And rood is spelled R-O-O-D. It means cross. In Old English, it's spelled R-O-D with a long O, road. If you go to a Anglican cathedral in particular in England, they used to separate the nave of the church from where the choir and the priest sat at the front with a big wooden screen and that. And on the top of it, there was a crucifix, and they call it a rood screen. So that's the same thing. So the Dream of the Rood is a vision. Again, it's a dream poem. It's the poet says, "I was asleep, and all of a sudden I heard a voice, and I woke up, and and there's a talking tree there, and it goes on.
Not a burning bush.
No, a talking tree,
Okay.
And tells them all about. It's the most sophisticated poem written in England before what? I don't know, before Milton, even better than Milton, I'm afraid, but before Shakespeare. Anyway, so it's in there, and it's a combination. It's hard to believe that somebody could do something so sophisticated in Anglo-Saxon England, because you have to remember all the jewelry they're making and things like that. They're making in a wooden hut with a dirt floor, and they're making gold jewelry, and we still have. Museums are full of it, beautiful things. And the books too. They're just being people sitting outside, and writing little books. And in this poem, it's from the 8th century, and we know that because there's a standing cross in northern England, in Northumbria, and it's a crucifix. It's got a depiction of Christ on it and things like that. But all around the outside of it, there's a little strip goes around it in the stone, and they carved part of the Dream of the Rood in runes. Runes are the old, magic letters that they used to write in before Christianity. And it's inscribed there, and that cross is from the 8th century, so the poem was in circulation by the 8th century. Well, what's fascinating is that, first of all, it's a dream vision. That's a genre that really took off, around the time of Chaucer. Chaucer writes all kinds of dream visions. But it's also written like a riddle, because the tree, it's what we would call a process riddle. Where I said the one about the book, how you kill the cow and you make the book eventually. Well, with the tree, it says, I was standing on the edge of the woods, fierce enemies came and tore me down, fashioned me into an instrument of torture, crucifix, right? Because the Romans crucified everybody they didn't like. And it goes on like that, and it says, and then it identifies with Christ. It suffers his pain as well. So it's very sophisticated. And it has morphing in it. You think morphing? Way back then? Yeah.
Well, when you say morphing, what do you mean?
I'm going to tell you. Where something changes its shape. So it changed from being an instrument of torture to becoming the means of salvation in the Christian context. And the cross identifies with Christ once he's nailed to it and says, they drove nails into me, we suffered, us butu, togadra, the two of us together, the cross and Christ. The cross is pretending that it's suffering the same things Christ did, because after Christ, in the Christian tradition, ascended and went away, the cross was still there. And on earth, the cross for Christians was the means of getting up there, of salvation. Okay. Now, when I say morph, if you ever read The Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens, everybody knows Charles. Maybe they've seen the movie. I haven't read the book, but the beginning of The Christmas Carol, Scrooge is going home, and his partner Morley has died. Right, a few days before, and he's going home. And all he's interested in is money. Donald Duck's Uncle Scrooge, money, money, money. And he gets home and he puts his hand up to open the door, and he has a lion-headed door knocker. And as he's reaching for it, the head turns into Marley's face. It's Marley's head. That's morphing, changing from one thing to the other, Ovid wrote a book. 15 books on the metamorphosis, things changing their shapes. And Dickens has that, okay? It's in The Dream of the Rood, 12 centuries earlier. And the Russian film director, Eisenstein, back in 1910 or 1921, I think it was, he made the Battleship Potemkin, I think it was called. It was really important movie, and they interviewed him about his ideas and where he got his ideas. You know what he said? From reading Dickens. This was a Russian film producer in 1910, 1920. He said, and he's talking about things like morphing, Marley's head and things like that. He says there's so much there. You just got to look. And,
I'm mindful of time, Bernard.
Yep.
But I wanted to maybe close on a couple of things. First of all, where can people find you? So where can people find you?
I got a website.
Yep. What's the website called?
It's on the card, evellum.com.au.
I'll make sure that goes in the show notes. You happy for me to put your contact details in the show notes as well?
Yeah, for sure. That's the whole point about this, to try and sell books. There's not much money in it, but if you don't make them, you can't distribute them, so nobody knows what your ideas are.
So in your nearly 5 decades in
43 years, yeah.
Well, sorry,
plus 12 years at university.
There you go.
Yeah.
So more than 5 decades.
Yeah.
Is there a piece of ancient wisdom, financial or otherwise, that you've applied to your own life, or that you found most inspirational or applied in any way in your life?
Oh, no, it's just you're influenced by what you read and what you study. I've been reading these poems for 50 years, and there's a group of them. They're called elegies, Old English elegies. And, they're one of the common themes in an elegy is the aging of the universe, or the aging of the world. And it's something they got from the Greeks and Romans. But they develop it in the Anglo-Saxon poetry, especially the elegies. They talk about how all this world is now in decline, and it's what's happening on the large scale there, the macrocosm, the universe is what's happening in each person in the universe at a microcosm. On the small level, each person that's part of the universe is in decline too. And what do we do when we're in decline? And they offer you advice on how to live your life and what to expect, down the road. So those are my favorite poems, things like that. Yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I'm sure these are probably not some of the best questions you've ever got when talking about your areas of expertise, but I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I always enjoy catching up with you. I enjoy coming and seeing you. We didn't really talk about your own library of texts. You've got an enormous array of texts and knowledge in this area. I love chatting with you about it, and given the opportunity, I'd love to have you back on for another podcast. And I'm sure, as you could tell, listeners could tell, we could go off on many, many different tangents and rabbit holes in all of the areas that you've studied and understand and now educate others about. But thanks for your friendship over the last decade and a half. Thank you for your wisdom, and thanks for joining us on our little podcast.
Thank you, Jay.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you're keen to understand more about how financial advice could benefit you, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Burke Britain FP, or Google Burke Britain Financial Partners. Check out our client reviews, testimonials, and make a time to meet one of our certified financial planners by clicking Book Now on our website. Thanks for listening.
Any information contained in this podcast is of a general nature only. No account was taken as to the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. Therefore, before making any decision, listeners should consider the appropriateness of any information with regard to their particular objective, financial situation, needs, and seek independent advice from a licensed professional specific to their circumstances.
All right, hit it.
That translates to, don't be a moron and act on what some random person says on a podcast. Take personal responsibility, do your homework, ask questions, and speak to an actual human that knows what they're talking about before you do anything. PB Financial Solutions Proprietary Limited, trading as Burke Britain Financial Partners, are authorised representatives of AMP Financial Planning Limited, AFS licence number 232706.